Welcome to the Roosevelt Show, episode 4. As you all know, our focus is to cover highlights on foreign affairs and U.S. politics Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. In today's Wednesday segment, we'll dive in first to the top picks on foreign news, and we're in a chess match between the United States, the NATO partners, and Russia. And just recently, Russia has freed a jailed US Marine Trevor Reed in exchange for a convicted Russian drug trafficker by the name of Konstantin Yaroshenko. But let me give you some background in terms of these exchanges. Each side looks at who's in jail on one side and looks to the benefit or looks through the benefit of who would, in this exchange, benefit their overall interest if they were returned back to their host country. So let me kind of give you an example of a comparison of why a drug smuggler is just as effective in the business of operations in terms of supply chains as a two-star general who works for the U.S. military. I would actually pit them up against a two-star general and say that they're more lethal, more aggressive, and more capable without having the regulatory oversight from, say, a government agency and having to abide by the rules. Now, if you all have worked in transnational organized crime, whether you are a special agent working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whether you're Central Intelligence Agency, MI5, whether you're in those locations in different countries, there's always a focus on dismantling organized crime. And Interpol obviously plays their role. And these organizations have focused a large part of resources in dismantling these organizations, what we call these transnational criminal organizations, because these enterprises essentially have their own industry. And these industries are unregulated. They are essentially run by some very ruthless and savvy businessmen who understand how to carry out orders for the purposes of economics. And there are no limits in terms of how far some of these leaders will go in terms of intimidation and aggressive activity. And some of the top smugglers, for example, manage a very large logistic network, and they're able to manage trade routes, manage connections. They also have access to information through their dealings, whether they've compromised government officials. They keep a ledger in terms of payroll activity, and essentially that could be used as blackmail and so forth. So these organizations, they keep dossiers on corrupt officials, political figures, and business leaders, and they essentially operate like an intelligence agency, and they have their own level of influence. So they are equivalent to the government essentially in their own world, and they do use their power to control organizations and influence outcomes. And in this particular case, President Putin has selected this gentleman, Konstantin, to come back home to Russia. And I think with this particular support from President Putin, once he is released, he'll have the backing of the government. Obviously, Putin selected him. And this becomes an asset that Putin can deploy in the field, and he's operational. And essentially, Putin can serve his leadership with a mandate that effectively operates as a proxy, leveraging the knowledge, leveraging the information, leveraging the logistic network to effectively move a commodity that NATO has sanctioned. So I think it's very interesting that we should look at these type of trades and we should think about these things a little more closely. This reminded me of the Sergeant Burdall. If you all recall, when Burdall was transferred for 5 Taliban members, if you remember, these were leaders of the Taliban who were held in Guantanamo Bay, and we gave them 5 Taliban members in exchange for Sergeant Burdall, who actually left the base, deserted, and this transfer was not equivalent because effectively these 5 leaders were deployed back into the operational fight and were essentially campaign leaders to provide motivation to the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan. So again, I think this leader will be put back into play operationally, and he will have a very significant influence in terms of executing Putin's demands in terms of their global objectives, good, bad, and ugly. So we've got to be very careful with these negotiations. Let's move on to the next topic here. As you all know, Russia has halted gas supplies to Bulgaria and Poland. This move is really being called a blackmail move, but I would say it's a move to further cripple the European nation's supply of energy. I think we all can agree to that. The consumer's quality of life will be impacted. he will continue to drive strategic objectives that impact the cost of living for adversaries. This impacts transportation. This impacts so many different things. And I think it forces NATO and European Union members to redraw their trade agreements and look to sources outside of their normal trade partners to, fill the gap, if you will. Now, what I would say this to be why it's important is because as these resources become more scarce and supply decreases, we're going to always have the equation of supply and demand. The alliance will be tested in the West, and we're going to need to balance the alliance and their needs based on the realities in each individual country, as these particular products do impact, the commodity market in terms of the byproducts that we often don't talk about commonly. And as Russia begins to withhold in terms of supply, we're going to see an impact on the petrochemical market. We're going to see impact on the feedstock, jet fuel, heating oil, and asphalt. So this is a strategic move that will put a different narrative in place that forces you to effectively think about the vital resources that your nation needs and your consumers use every day for their businesses, for their daily life in terms of quality life. So we're going to have to really figure out how NATO is going to survive without having these critical commodities. But this is the hot topic of today, and you all are feeling it out there. Last but not least, we've continued to cover the Tesla conversation. As I had mentioned on Monday, we may have seen a Elon Musk purchase. We've seen it. Twitter has accepted the deal. But I would just caution you to think about this, that this is not solely about the freedom of speech. This is also about business to consumer transactions and meeting the customer needs. And I think Elon Musk has what President Trump has had, and that is a direct access to the consumer base. He will have invested, his money, the $40 billion plus dollars, into what I would call a political machine. And this machine can convert all different types of business transactions. There's data that is very critical. There are also calls from committees in Congress to have these leaders in social media appear before those committees. So this is a pillar of the American economy, and communication and social media are driving the American industry in terms of elections, in terms of business dealings, and influencing campaigns. So I would say he's going to get access to behavioral data in terms of consumer buying patterns. He's going to be able to navigate a lot of things with the use of this platform in terms of creating social movements and so forth. So let's look at it a bit more expanded in our version. And I will tell you that I think private equity venture capital funds are going to be pretty excited about this move because they see Elon Musk as someone who comes from a background of investment in terms of having the experience buying companies, starting them, making them successful. And I think this move is going to really change the tide in the United States. Okay, so again, thank you for the Wednesday catch up, all for following us. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and subscribe to our Instagram. Again, thank you. Welcome to the Adam Roosevelt Show, and we will see you on Friday.